what do you think explains the prevalence of, in people's minds, in the general public anyway, that there's just one strain of Islam, and that strain is usually associated with kind of a very literal interpretation and with a very conservative Wahhabi practice?
Yeah. Well, I think part of that is just economics and politics. Part of that is the fact that Saudi Arabia became a very wealthy state and started spending a lot of money on publishing materials that became very influential in the way that Islam was understood and then taught. And if you wanted to teach and you needed books,
Right.
what books were available that you could afford or that were given to you free of charge? Well, the ones that came out of Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
And so you have sort of seen this Saudification of a lot of the Muslim world as a result of that.
Right.
But part of it also, I think, is deeper than that. And it's not so much just about doctrines. It's about what Islam has come to mean to Muslims in different parts of the world. And that is that I think for a lot of Muslims, especially Muslims who live in post-colonial societies, Islam has not become just a religion or even a way of life. It's become an identity and an identity movement.
Right.
And so, now I'm not saying Islamic identity is a new thing or even a bad thing.
Sure.
But where there's a difference between treating something as a religion and treating something as an identity movement, because once it becomes an identity movement, suddenly you will emphasize those aspects or those teachings or those interpretations of Islam that differentiate you from whoever it is you want to be differentiated from.
Exactly. So it becomes something much less universal. Well, totally not universal.
And so if you are in the Middle East, for example, we are Muslims now. The Islam that we will represent will be that Islam that makes us as different as possible from our Western colonizers.
Right, okay. So it's
because if we do something that in any way reflects them, then we are somehow compromising our post-colonial independence.
Sure.
It's not articulated that way. It's not understood that way. But you can see how that is, how that's happening. Like you can see the way in which interpretations of Islam that are rigid and hardline and anti-Western will be favoured. And it's not to say that those interpretations in every circumstance will be wrong or unjustifiable.
Sure.
But where that becomes kind of like a default, that's an issue. You know, that is where I think Islam is becoming used in the service of identity rather than in the service of the religion and the texts themselves. Right?
Okay.
And so you can see this for Muslims in the West. This becomes really important. If you're a Muslim living in the West, one of the things you should be doing, if you're, say, a scholar, an Islamic scholar in the West, is understanding what Islam looks like in that environment.
Okay.
Which means you incorporate aspects of Western culture, because that's the urf, that's the custom, into your legal reasoning.
Right.
But when you do that, now that starts to be a lot less sort of independent.
Right.
And that becomes an issue. You know, that's where people can start to get confused, and you get the Merry Christmas thing.
Okay.
Because why would you want that fatwa? Because it makes us feel like we're really independent and we're not bowing to anybody. There's a kind of independence about that. And you see this turn up in harmless ways as well, like, the phenomenon of Islamic commerce, where you chuck an Islamic label on something and then sell it.
All right.
Yeah. I mean, halal's different because halal is a legal requirement, so that's fine. But where you start putting halal on things that would otherwise always be halal.
Right, something that's Sharia compliant.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are certain examples where that really matters, and I can understand, for example, the Islamic finance industry and where that comes from, because that's based on a very important idea of the prohibition of interest-based transactions. And I get all that, but sometimes you're selling a haircut.
Right. Yes.
I mean, a halal haircut. Now, I can see there are certain arguments that certain haircuts may or may not be permissible, but by and large, you don't, a haircut doesn't have to be performed by a Muslim butcher or something, right? It's not Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, let's cut your hair. It doesn't work that way.
Okay.
But you're starting to see these things attached to all sorts of practices as a way of entrenching identity you know.
Right. It's a form of, I suppose you could term it Islamization, but
Yeah.
you know, and Islamization is a pretty new term. It's a pretty new phenomenon.
Well, what's interesting about Islamization is that it's a modern political project.
Right.
You didn't have Islamization in the medieval Islamic world
Right.
because they were Islamic societies and there was no need to prove that things were... You didn't have to Islamize anything.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, you don't need to prove anything.
Yeah. But if you're in a post-colonial environment where your whole identity has been suppressed by colonial power, so take in the Middle East, where you had very strident attempts by colonial powers, especially the British in the case of Egypt, but I mean the French as well, really strident attempts to de-Islamize things and to secularize everything.
Okay.
Once you claim independence, part of that is going to be a desire to reassert Islamic identity, to re-Islamize things.
Right.
It's a perfectly natural response. I'm not saying that response is incomprehensible or anything like that.
Sure.
But what I'm saying is that is a response that is really about sociology and politics. It's not about theology. Yeah.
Okay.
Theology is used, but it's part of... but it's not the driver of the reasoning. And that's why if you look at a lot of the really important figures in Islamist politics in the Middle East, they weren't theologians.
Okay.
They were engineers or they were journalists.
All right.
So Qutb, for example, was a journalist or a writer. Ayman al-Zawahiri, a doctor. I mean, they're not theologians. They didn't come out of studying at the feet of someone in the desert in Mauritania. They came out of secular professions.
Right.
And they were running a social and political project, which is understandable.
Sure.
It's an understandable project.
Sure.
I can see where it came from, but it's not the same thing as a theological project.
Sure.
And that's a really important distinction.
Well, Waleed, thank you very much. I think that really clears up a lot of things, and also opens up a whole lot of ground to explore. I mean, in terms of pluralism and in terms of liberalism, in terms of the secular movement. But we'll leave that for another time.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.